Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Dani and today it's time to talk about the books that I read in July. I'm not going to go over all the stats about the month, but I'm going to put them here on the screen just so you can look at it. And one thing that I'll note is that the series that I caught up, or DNF, I count them the same way because they're like out of my in progress series. So this month I started 2 series that I'm not going to continue, and I think that was it for series. But I read 5 books, so let's talk about them in the order that I read them. First book that I read in July was on my TBR for the month, and it was Sea Prayer by Khaled Hosseini. This is a tiny, very short book. This is basically a poem. It is kind of unfair to count it as a book, but it's bound up in a book, and it's on Goodreads, so we're counting it. But it's basically a poem written by this author who I've read one book before by him, which was 1,000 Splendid Suns, and I have not read The Kite Runner yet, but I do want to. And this one is mostly about immigration, but in the point of view of a father telling his son, when they're fleeing the country, just like telling him about life. I'll say, I'm not going to give you spoilers about it because, like I said, it's basically a poem. It's filled with very impactful illustrations, and there's a little bit of text, so you can definitely read this in one sitting, and I do recommend. It's very powerful. I gave this 5 stars. I don't think there's a way for me to judge it another way that it's not 5 stars just because of what it is. So I really liked it. I don't know if it's available on ebook or something that would make it easier to read, because this is a hardcover and it's a little bit expensive, but I got it at a thrift shop. That's why I bought it, but I would recommend it. Then the second book that I read in the month was also on my TBR, and it was The Burning Girls by CJ Tudor. I've read a lot of books by this author already. The Hiding Place, The Chalkman, and The Other People. And this was my 4th book by her. And I really enjoyed all of them. I think I gave all of them 4 stars, and it was no different with this one. I think this was maybe for like 4.5, and I rounded down to 4 stars, and all of them on Goodreads, and all of them are always entertaining and completely over the top. So this one, we're following the story of a vicar and her daughter, and they moved to this small town so she can replace the vicar that died in that church, and he hanged himself in the church. And also there's a lot of other story and history in this small town with some girls and some religious people that were burned at the stake a long time ago. And some years before the story, there were 2 teenagers that disappeared. And there's some weird stuff happening now that they just moved there. So we're following all of that. It's a lot, but there's some type of subplot with exorcism that is kind of interesting. And I wish we got more of, not paranormal, but more of like the horror aspect, because this was a thriller almost in the horror. It's definitely spooky at times, but it was a lot of fun. It was maybe my favorite one by the author so far. I think I really liked The Chalkman. Was the first one that I read, but I don't even remember much anymore about it. But I think this one was my favorite by her so far, and I do want to read her other books because I'm always entertained. They're not 5 stars, but for a thriller should be 5 stars. It's really hard for me because there's so much and have to depend a lot on the ending. And I did like the ending, but I also guessed one of the, I don't know if it was even supposed to be a reveal, but there's something that I pretty much knew throughout the whole book that at some point was revealed. I'm like, wasn't I already supposed to know this? But I was surprised by a lot of other things here as well. So I was entertained throughout, and I would also recommend it. The next book that I finished in the month was an audiobook, and it was The Golden Spoon by Jessa Maxwell. This was pitched as The Great British Bake Off meets Only Murders in the Building, I think. I think that was it. I think that was the comparison. And yes, it's but mostly The Great British Bake Off. So I haven't watched the Great British Bake Off, but I have watched all the available seasons of Canadian Baking Show, which is pretty much the same thing, but in Canada. And I love it. It's one of I love reality competition shows like that. I always have so much fun with them, and I love baking competition shows. So Canadian Baking Show is amazing, and this book was mostly describing the show and some sort of intrigue that's happening there. But we saw like every dish that they had to create, every just like what's the name of the thing? Like that every episode and someone was leaving in the end of every episode, and we're just following that. So if you don't like those type of shows and that concept doesn't seem interesting to you, I would not recommend this. The thriller aspect of this book happens in the prologue and then in the last like 20% of the book. The whole rest, there, like I said, there's some intrigue, but it's not a big mystery. You kind of know what's happening the whole time. And we're kind of expecting for the thing that was hinted at the prologue to happen in the actual story. And it takes a long time. But I was so in it for the baking part that I just had a lot of fun. I don't remember what my rating was. Probably 4 stars. Yeah, I gave it 4 stars. It was just very entertaining. Like I said, I would recommend if you like this type of reality show and you're okay with a thriller that just takes its time to become actually a thriller. The review in the end was not that satisfying, but the whole thing about it for me was that the entire book was a lot of fun to follow the participants baking. The audiobook was awesome because we have the point of view of a lot of different characters and we get different narrators for each of them. So it was easy to follow who was speaking because of the different voices. And that was kind of the reason why I picked this audiobook. Not the full cast, but I was having a lot of hard time with audiobooks lately, and I was DNFing a lot of audiobooks because I just wasn't in the mood for them. So I'm like, I'm just gonna look for a narrator that I enjoy, and I'm going to look for another book that she narrated. So 2 audiobooks that I really liked were The Cloisters and Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead. I was mixing it up with the other one. So those 2 audiobooks were narrated by the same person, and I just looked at what else she narrated, and The Golden Spoon was one of them. So I grabbed that because I was already interested in it, and she's just one of the narrators, but it was fine. So like some of the narrators I didn't like so much, but most of them it was just fun to have the full cast, that's what I mean. And I really enjoyed it. So I would recommend the audiobook also for sure for this one. And it was just a really fun time. So I had 1 5 stars, 2 4 stars that I had a lot of fun with. The 5 stars, no. It was very impactful and sad. But the 2 thrillers were a lot of fun and just an amazing time. And then we go into the books that were not so much. So after that, I read A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is a beautiful Fairy Loot edition, and I was having a hard time just focusing on a book, and then I just wanted to pick a beautiful book to read. And I heard that this was told in letters, so I'm like, this is probably easy to get through, and I grabbed this one. And it started amazing. I really loved the beginning of it. So this one is told in the perspective of one of Dracula's brides, and she's writing him letters about their life, basically, from when he found her from the beginning to what happened in the end. That we know what happens right in the beginning, kind of like in the prologue as well, but I'm not gonna say. But one of my favorite things about this book is that it never says that she's writing it to Dracula. It says on the actual synopsis of it, but I think it was unnecessary, and I just like the way that it's told without saying that it's Dracula, because I don't know, I just love that aspect. And like we know all the time, but he's not named, and I just think that's a really cool aspect of this book. And the beginning of the book, it is really easy to get through. The font is really big, and the letters are easy to get through, but that got old really quickly. So the writing is beautiful, but the actual plot, it didn't change from the beginning to end. So by the middle of it, I was already bored. It was a lot of the same. We kind of knew already where it was going, and it was just repeating a lot of the same things. So I just got bored by the middle. So I gave it 3 stars in the end, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, I just gave it 3 stars in the end because the beginning was really good, and then by the middle I didn't care anymore, and that feeling continued throughout the whole book. This was first self-published, and then when it was traditionally published, she added an epilogue that didn't exist on the self-published, and I didn't like that because I didn't like the actual the epilogue. Not that she added it, I don't care that she added it, but I didn't like the actual epilogue because it went more into the thing that I dislike on this book the most, because I wanted it to be more of a horror, and it is with the relationship of the main character and Dracula, but then there's a lot of romance involved, not between them. Between them is a very abusive relationship, but with other characters, there's a lot of romance. And you know how I am with romance books. They don't work for me so much, and that's kind of what we got for a lot of it. So 3 stars. It was a really great beginning, but then it just lost me. But beautiful writing. I really love the writing, and some quotes and some just sentences are really good. And then maybe I'll repeat myself a little bit because that's the same reason why the Divine Rivals didn't work for me. This one is by Rebecca Ross, and this dust jacket is 1 and 2. Fall. This is the beautiful Outgrade edition. Also, again, a gorgeous book that I wanted to read because I want to get through my sprayed edges shelf. And this tells a story of 2 teenagers. They're like young adults. They're like 18 or so. She works at the newspaper and she wants to be a columnist. This is like historical fiction inspired from like World War I, but it's still a fantasy world. But she works at the newspaper and she wants to be a columnist, and there's this guy that works there. He also wants to be a columnist, so they're rivals because they're like going for the same job. This part of the rivalry and like the enemies to lovers or rivals to lovers aspect reminded me a lot of the Hating Game, which I hated because it doesn't make sense. Like there's no reason for that rivalry that's given in the story for her to hate this boy so much. Like he never does anything for her to hate him so much. Like I don't get the rivals to lovers, like the rivals part, the enemies part. I don't think that is well explained. But there is the magical aspect here in which they have a way to communicate with each other through a magical thing that she writes letters, and he gets the letters and he writes back, but she doesn't know who he is, who she's writing to, and he knows that it's her, and that already lost me also. That's another aspect of this book that really lost me because I really hate for how much time he spent lying to her on this aspect. But this book is very well loved by a lot of people, so clearly I'm the exception here, so don't go with my thoughts on this. A lot of people love it. I just don't like romance, and I don't think the romance here was well done and well explained, and the lying part just really got to my nerves. But the fantasy part was almost non-existent. There's like a war between gods that doesn't really matter. There's not much to it. And in the beginning of the book, her brother goes to this war, and she kind of wants to find out what happened because then he disappears. So I would really like for us to see more of the gods and the war and her brother being lost and all of that instead of the romance that we got. So it was not for me. So both of these books are going to have sequels that I'm not continuing. So those are the ones that the series that I DNF'd. I read both books completely, but I DNF'd the series. Both are duologies. This one I don't know actually. The sequel, it's not even a sequel, it's like a companion book, more about Carmilla instead of Dracula. So if that sounds interesting, keep an eye out for it. And this one, it's going to be out this year already. And the ending is intriguing, but I just don't care enough about the romance in this to continue. So I gave this 2.5 stars. I think I rounded it down to 2, just because it's really not for me. But clearly it's for a lot of people who like historical romance. I would recommend this for people who like historical romance with a touch of fantasy in it. I think this was the fastest wrap-up that I've ever filmed in my life. But I did talk about all of the books, so that's it. I didn't read any big high fantasy this month. I read a lot of the Blade itself, so I guess I could talk about that. I read maybe a little bit more than half of it, and I'm enjoying it, but there's not enough to grab me in the book yet, and it's just really slow to read for me to focus only on that. But it is a series that I want to continue. It's not that I'm not enjoying the book, but I kind of paused that to read this ones that I just mentioned. But I am in the middle of the Blade itself. And I also read maybe half of the book that wouldn't burn in July, and I'm still reading it now in August, continuing it. And again, also enjoying it a lot. This one definitely grabbed me from the beginning. I'm loving a lot of it, but it's gotten a little bit slow now in the middle, but I will finish that. So keep an eye out for my review for that in the end of August. And I did DNF 3 books in July. I DNF'd Pageboy, not because I was not enjoying it, just like I said, audiobooks were not working for me so much. at the time. I might go back to it at some point. But I agree with what a lot of people said. The story, like not the story, like his life is so interesting, but the way that the book is structured with going back and forth in time, it kind of loses me a little bit, and it feels like more essays. And when one is over, I need something to pull me back in the next part. But it was an interesting one, and good narration, of course, narrated by the author. I also DNF'd Wool. I was listening to the audiobook for a little bit, and I watched the first season on Apple TV, and it was so good. The show was so amazing, and I know that the book is highly praised as well, so I went to the book to listen to it. But I'm enjoying the TV show so much that I don't want to spoil myself for what's going to happen. So I stopped Wool when it kind of reached where the TV show is, and I'm not going to go back to it at least until we get more of the TV show, and then I'll go back to it and like listen to what's left. From what I listened, it's really faithful to the book. Like the TV show and the book are really, really similar. And I feel like the TV show had even more time to develop a lot of the characters than the book did, because the book is told in short stories. So I'm going with the TV show on this one, and I'm gonna try to keep myself not spoiled for what happens on the book. And I also did have The First Man on the Moon, which is a classic by H.G. Wells. It was just boring. I read most of it, like I listened to most of it, but then I thought it was over and there was still a lot in the book. I'm like, what are we still doing here? You told the whole story. It's very interesting because it's told, it was written before men went to the moon. So there was a lot that just like the science that doesn't make sense, but it's fascinating to see how he made up that stuff in a way that makes sense for the book. But we know now that's like, no, like that does not make sense in real life. So that part is fascinating just because of when it was written. So those are the 3 books that I DNF'd in July. So I went through a lot of books, just did not finish many of them. Let me know if you read any of these books or if you are going to read any of the books that I mentioned here. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye!